Chapter 1. The Frozen Howl. The wind howled like a dying god across the Norscan tundra, dragging ice and ash in its gnarled grip. Snow fell in heavy, jagged sheets, whipped sideways by the gale, burying bone heaps and forgotten altars beneath its white fury. Trees bent and groaned, their limbs crusted with frost, and the sea, once restless and cruel, now lay under a prison of cracked ice, its fury muted, but not forgotten. At the heart of this frozen desolation stood the long hall of the Wolfmaw tribe, its blackened timbers clawing at the sky like the ribs of some ancient beast. Smoke poured from a hole in the roof, thick and greasy, the only warmth in miles. The air outside was a killing thing, a spiteful spirit that scoured skin raw and snapped the breath in your lungs. But inside there was fire, mead, and meat, though precious little of it. 50 warriors packed the long hall, their faces ruddy from the fire and weathered by years of war and suffering. Furs hung from their broad shoulders, crusted with salt and frost. Scarred hands clenched around drinking horns or bone-handled blades. The scent of blood, sweat, smoke, and unwashed flesh filled the air, mingling with the tang of roasted seal fat. Laughter rumbled low, cruel and bitter, like the growl of a dying beast. At the far end of the hall sat Jorulf Bloodeye, chieftain of the Wolfmaw, his throne carved from the ribs of a white wyrm long dead. He was a brute of a man, his skin a patchwork of old wounds and tribal brands. One eye was missing, the socket hollow and seared shut by iron long ago. The other, an ember-red orb, watched all with the patience of a predator. His beard, thick and tangled, held the bones of slain enemies and the tokens of fell gods. Beside him stood his son, Thorgard, a silent shadow with a gaze like a storm on the horizon. Where Jorulf was fire and wrath, Thorgard was cold stone. He had not yet earned the scars of leadership, but his silence carried weight. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of raven dark hair tied behind his neck, he looked every inch the warrior prince, though his eyes betrayed unease. He had seen something in the ice that morning, something that watched him. "More meat!" Jorulf bellowed, slamming his drinking horn against the table. "Let the gods see we are not cowed by the storm." A roar of approval followed. Plates clattered as a scrawny thrall dragged in the haunch of a snow bear, half-cooked and seared over fire-charred iron. Blood still oozed from it. Knives were drawn with relish. Teeth tore through fat and sinew. Mead spilled. Boasts of battle rang out over the crackling fire. Tales of raiding Kislevite villages, of flensing corpses, of howls in the night that foretold glory. And then, silence. It fell like a blade, unbidden, unnatural. The door creaked open. A gust of snow whirled in, scattering embers and rattling bones. Figures turned, weapons half-drawn. A woman entered, draped in shadow-black furs, her face hidden beneath a veil of crow feathers and bone charms. Her presence was a cold thing, like grave wind over a barrow. Idis the seeress. She did not walk so much as glide. The crowd parted without words. Even the drunkest warrior did not meet her gaze. Whispers hissed from her every step, as if the floor itself recoiled. She moved toward the chieftain's fire, and the flames dimmed, shivering, as if recognizing something older than warmth. "80s?" Jorulf growled, leaning forward. "Why do you disturb the feast of the wolf's howl?" She did not answer at once. Instead, she reached into her furs and withdrew a pouch of human skin. From it, she cast bones into the fire, shards of finger, femur, and skull. The fire flared, sickly green. Then she spoke. Her voice was not hers alone. It was layered, male and female, young and ancient, joyous and tormented, a chorus of whispers that made the soul tremble. The winds howl not in hunger but in warning. The blood moon bleeds for you. The great eye turns. The dark tide rises. She pointed a clawed finger directly at the fire, and it twisted. Flames curled inward, revealing shapes. A warrior wreathed in shadow, wings of black ichor, eyes like twin vortexes of madness, a crown of bone and flame atop a screaming visage. "Among you shall rise," she hissed, "clad in blood and shadow, a prince of the dark gods, daemon-born, world-breaker." A collective intake of breath. Some drew blades. Others crossed themselves with bone charms. Jorulf rose, snarling. "What trickery is this? Speak plainly, crone." Adis turned her gaze, empty sockets, glowing faintly blue, toward him. "Your son bears the mark. I saw it in the blood runes, in the entrails of the warhound. I dreamed his voice among the screams of the lost. Thorgard is the vessel. His fate is not of man, but of gods." Gasps. A few warriors stood, hands to hilts. Thorgard did not move. His face betrayed no emotion, but his fists clenched. The fire behind his eyes flickered with something: fear, rage, longing. Jorulf looked from Adis to his son, then back. "You dare accuse my blood of treachery?" Adis stepped back into the shadows, her voice already fading. "It is no accusation, it is prophecy. You may kill the vessel, but you cannot stop the tide. The gods have chosen. Chaos comes." Then she was gone. The flames returned to orange. The warmth crept back in, but the chill had taken root. Jorulf looked at his son. Thorgard stared at the fire, unmoving. The feast continued, but quieter. Unease hung thick. Old songs were not sung. Old jokes were not told. And outside, in the storm, something howled back. Chapter 2. Marked in Blood. The dawn came crawling across the ice-choked sea like a wounded beast. Pale, sickly light seeped through cracks in the clouds, illuminating the Wolfmaw village with a wan glow that made everything look dead. The long hall, with its black timbers and frost-encrusted roof, sat like a cairn over a grave. Smoke drifted from its vent hole in a thin, sluggish thread. The storm had eased in the night, but it left the world muffled, heavy, and still. Even the gulls were silent. Inside, the embers of last night's feast glowed weakly in the hearth. Bones littered the tables, seal ribs, fish heads, scraps of charred bear flesh gnawed to splinters. Warriors snored in heaps, their mead-sodden breath mingling with the smell of sweat, blood, and rancid tallow. Somewhere a child whimpered in a dream, and its mother whispered a prayer to gods who cared little for mortal mouths. Thorgard sat alone near the dying fire, the glow flickering across his face like a warning. He had not slept. He had not even moved from his seat since the seeress's words had shattered the feast. The prophecy echoed in his skull, relentless. "One among you shall rise, clad in blood and shadow." His father's gaze from the night before still burned in his mind, not angered, but searching, like the eye of a hunter measuring prey. His hands were clasped tight on his knees, knuckles white. He could feel it, something thrumming beneath his skin, like a drumbeat far away. Every breath steamed in the cold, ragged and shallow. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked down at his chest and froze. The skin there, bare where his tunic had slipped open, was no longer his own. Lines of raw, livid crimson scored across it, rising from beneath the flesh like a brand pressed from inside out. They coiled and twisted in shapes not meant for mortal tongues. Jagged curves, interlocking angles, and impossible geometry that seemed to writhe if he stared too long. The chaos rune pulsed faintly, as though it were alive. A hiss escaped him, a sound part pain, part horror. He clawed at his own skin, scraping fingernails until they drew blood, but the mark did not fade. It only spread faintly under his touch, the lines crawling outward like veins of molten iron. "By the gods," he muttered, voice trembling, "what have you done to me?" The sound of movement behind him broke his trance. A thrall, a boy no older than 15 winters, stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide. He had seen the mark. He dropped the water pail he was carrying. It spilled across the floor, hissing on the embers. "Run," Thorgard said quietly. The boy bolted like a hare. Within moments the long hall came alive. Warriors stirred from their sleep, muttering and coughing. Someone shouted from outside. The horn of summoning sounded once, sharp and shrill. Feet stomped. Blades rasped from sheaths. The smell of iron and panic seeped into the hall as more eyes turned toward Thorgard. By the time Jorulf entered, the hall was a ring of faces, some grim, some fearful, some snarling for blood. The chieftain strode through them like a storm-given flesh, his bear fur cloak dragging behind him, his axe at his belt. His one eye fell upon his son, upon the mark glowing faintly on his chest. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then eldest Skorvald, the oldest of the tribe, his skin parchment thin and his hair white as ash, stepped forward. His voice cracked, but carried like a whip. "You see it, Jorulf. The seeress's words were true. The boy is marked. Chaos festers in him." A murmur rose. Others spat on the ground, muttering prayers to their patron gods. The air was a living thing, coiling tight with fear. "Exile him," Skorvald snarled, "before the taint spreads, before the dark gods claim us all." "Kill him," another elder barked, a woman named Hjalda with a throat scar that turned her voice into a rasp. "Slit his throat, burn the body, cast the ashes into the sea. Spare the tribe his curse." The mutter became a roar. "Exile! Execution! Burn the cursed!" Thorgard rose slowly to his feet, towering over some of them. His fists clenched so hard his knuckles bled. He looked at them all with a cold, steady gaze. "You call me cursed," he said, "but who among you does not pray to the same gods that you fear? Who among you has not spilled blood for their favor?" A ripple passed through the hall, some looking away, ashamed, others bristling at his defiance. "Enough," Jorulf growled, stepping between his son and the crowd. His eye burned like a forge. "No son of mine is cast out like a thrall dog. This is my blood, my heir. He stays." Skorvald's eyes bulged. "You would damn us all for your pride?" Jorulf's hand shot out, closing around the old man's throat like an iron trap. He lifted him off the ground with one arm, bones creaking under his grip. "I would damn any who dare name my blood weak." He hurled the elder backward. The man crashed into a table, splintering it, coughing blood. Gasps and curses erupted from the crowd, but none stepped forward. Jorulf drew his axe, its blade nicked and darkened with old gore, and held it low at his side. "Any who touch him," he said, voice low and deadly, "touch me. Any who would kill him must first kill me." The silence that followed was a void. You could hear the fire crackle, the drip of blood from Skorvald's split lip. The rune on Thorgard's chest throbbed brighter, as if feeding on the tension. Finally, Hjalda spat and turned away. "Then you'll bring ruin on us all, chieftain. The gods have chosen. You can't fight the tide." One by one, the others backed off, some muttering curses, others crossing themselves. Fear had not left them, but Jorulf's wrath had cowed it for now. When they were gone, Jorulf turned to his son. His expression was a fortress, but his eye held a flicker of something, sorrow maybe. "You've brought a shadow into my hall," he said quietly. "I don't know if it's yours or theirs, but you are still my blood." Thorgard stared back, his voice hoarse. "I didn't choose this." "No," Jorol said, "but the gods seldom ask." He clapped his son's shoulder, heavy and final. Then he left, his fur cloak trailing behind him like a storm cloud. Thorgard looked down at the rune again. It pulsed faintly, as though it were breathing. Outside, the wind began to rise, and over the sound of it came the distant howl of something far larger than a wolf. Chapter 3. The Trial of Skulls. The sky above the northern wastes was a bruised purple, heavy clouds rolling like the backs of great beasts. Winds screamed across the snow-clad tundra, flaying exposed skin raw. A crescent moon hung low, blood-red, casting a dim, malignant glow over the field of broken stones where the old gods of Norsca had once been worshipped. Now, the field served a different purpose, a killing ground where disputes between tribes were settled by steel and sacrifice. The Wolfmaw tribe had gathered in a ring, their shapes hulking and indistinct beneath heavy furs. Warriors beat their shields with the flats of their axes, a low, steady drumbeat of anticipation that echoed across the barren expanse. The smell of oil, sweat, and blood wafted from them like steam from a slaughterhouse. In the center of the stone ring stood Thorgard, stripped to the waist, frost glinting off his scarred skin. His breath misted in the bitter cold, but he did not shiver. Across his chest the chaos rune glimmered faintly beneath his flesh, a dark red glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. He could feel it even now, like molten iron under his ribs, coiled and waiting. Beyond him, at the opposite edge of the ring, waited his opponent, the champion of the rival Bearclaw tribe. Ulfric's Skullbreaker was a mountain of a man, draped in bear hides, his arms thick as shipmasts. His face was a ruin of old scars, one eye milky blind, the other burning with savage glee. In his hands he held a twin-headed axe, its edges jagged from decades of killing. Bones and teeth dangled from his braids, trophies of warriors long dead. This was the Trial of Skulls. To prove his loyalty to the Wolfmaw, to silence the whispers of chaos, Thorgard had to slay Ulfric before the gathered tribes. There would be no retreat, no mercy, and no doubt left standing. A herald stepped forward, an old warrior whose voice carried like steel on ice. "By the gods of the north," he intoned, "let blood speak the truth. Let the skulls judge worth. No shield but your will, no mercy but the axe." The crowd roared approval, horns blew, the air shook with anticipation. Thorgard met Ulfric's single good eye. The champion grinned, showing teeth yellowed and cracked. "I'll split you in two, whelp," he snarled, his voice a thunderous growl, "and feed your heart to the crows." Gord said nothing. His fingers flexed around the hilt of his weapon, a single-edged war axe carved from the femur of a sea dragon. Its blade, nicked and pitted from years of use, glinted dully. He rolled his shoulders once, loosening his muscles, and listened to the slow thump of his heart. "Steady," he told himself. "Steady." The herald dropped his arm. "Begin." Ulfric charged with a roar that rattled the stones. His twin-headed axe came down in a killing arc that would have split an ox in half. Thorgard sidestepped, snow spraying beneath his boots. The blade missed him by inches, smashing into the frozen ground with a dull crack. Shards of ice and rock flew up like shrapnel. Gord countered, swinging his own axe low, aiming for Ulfric's knee. The bare claw twisted, the blade biting only fur. Ulfric backhanded him with a gauntleted fist, the blow like a hammer. Thorgard staggered back, blood spraying from a split lip. The crowd howled, stamping their feet, baying for blood. Uldric pressed the attack, his massive axe swinging in brutal, looping arcs, each strike intended to crush, not merely cut. Thorgard ducked and weaved, but even his strength was beginning to falter. He caught a blow on his axe handle, the impact jolting up his arms and numbing his fingers. "You fight like a thrall," Ulfric mocked, spittle flying from his mouth. "Where's the beast the seeress promised?" Gort snarled and drove forward, closing the distance. He slammed his shoulder into Ulfric's chest, ramming the larger man back a step. His axe flashed, scoring a line across the champion's ribs. Blood welled, black in the moonlight. Ulfric only laughed, swinging his axe in a vicious upswing that tore a gash across Thorgard's thigh. Pain flared, bright and sharp. Thorgard fell to one knee, breath coming in ragged bursts. He could taste copper in his mouth, his vision blurred. He saw Ulfric's shadow loom above him, axe raised high for the killing stroke. And then he felt it. The mark on his chest burned, a sudden, searing heat that stole his breath. The rune pulsed, faster and faster, until it matched the thunder of his heart. His veins thrummed like iron strings. His vision sharpened, colors too bright, the world too clear. The whispers he'd heard in his dreams came back, a chorus of voices not his own, murmuring, coaxing, promising. Right. When Ulfric's axe came down, Thorgard moved faster than he had ever moved. He surged up, catching the haft of the twin-headed axe with his bare hand. Flesh sizzled against the frozen iron, but his grip was unbreakable. He wrenched it aside, the force snapping one of the axe's heads clean off. Ulfric's good eye widened. "What?" Thorgard's own axe lashed out, not in a clean warrior's stroke, but a savage overhand chop that bit deep into Ulfric's collarbone. Bone cracked, blood fountained, hot and steaming in the cold air. The bear claw roared in pain, staggering back. But Thorgard did not stop. He dropped his axe and leapt on the larger man like a wolf, fists and teeth ablur. He smashed his forehead into Ulfric's nose, breaking it with a wet crunch. His hands found the champion's throat and squeezed, thumbs digging in until they broke the skin. Ulfric flailed, clawing at Thorgard's arms, but the younger man's strength was not natural anymore. It was a tide. With a guttural cry, Thorgard drove his thumbs into Ulfric's eye sockets. There was a wet, tearing sound, and a scream cut short. Blood and vitreous fluid spurted over his hands. Ulfric convulsed once, twice, then went limp, collapsing like a felled tree. Thorgard knelt over the corpse, chest heaving, his hands dripping with blood and gore. The rune on his chest blazed bright enough to cast shadows. Steam curled from his skin, as if the cold no longer touched him. The crowd was silent. Even the wind seemed to die. Warriors stared, some in awe, others in horror. Slowly Thorgard rose, his breath a ragged hiss. He reached down, tore Ulfric's skull free from his neck with a single brutal wrench, and held it high. Blood ran down his arm in rivers. The Wolfmaw roared, a savage cheer, but it was tinged with fear. They had seen victory, yes, but they had also seen something else, something older and darker, something no mortal man should bear. Gerulf watched from the edge of the ring, his one eye narrowed. His son had proved his loyalty, but at what cost? The trial of skulls was over. Thorgard had won. Yet the mark burned brighter than ever, and in the silence between cheers he could almost hear it whispering still. Chapter 4. Shadows in the North. The land was changing. What was once hard, cold wilderness now twisted with wrongness. The winds carried more than snow and screams. They carried whispers, faint voices that wormed into men's ears while they slept, coiling through dreams like serpents. Warriors began waking with blood on their hands and no memory of how it got there. Fires burned with green flames, the smoke forming faces that watched, smiling with too many teeth. Ravens flew in spirals for hours overhead before falling dead from the sky, their eyes plucked out not by beaks, but from within. The Wolfmaw tribe had grown silent. It was late into the season of ice, when the sun no longer rose fully, and each hour bled into the next like spilled ink. The sky was a permanent bruise, casting the snow in shades of iron and ash. The beasts of the land, stags, wolves, even the great tusked mammoths, had fled south. In their place came creatures of a different sort. From the northern passes, riders had been spotted, tall, twisted silhouettes atop mounts stitched together from bone and sinew. At first they came in twos, threes, but by the third week a scout returned screaming, frost-bitten fingers torn away, ranting of a host that blackened the tundra. He died before he could speak again, but not before carving a spiral into his own chest with a shard of stone. Jorith Bloodeye stood atop the frost-encased cliff that overlooked the bay of broken ships. He stared into the howling blizzard, his one eye narrowed against the wind. Behind him, warriors waited, grim men with blood-stained beards and cracked shields. Tension rode the air like a coiled snake. "They are coming," growled Ulfar, the chieftain's shield brother, scarred and half-mad from a life of endless war. "They wear no colors. They chant no battle songs. Just silence, like the grave." Rolf did not answer. His fingers flexed around the haft of his axe. He felt it too, the pressure in the air, like standing beneath a falling mountain. Not just war, something worse, something old. That night, the first wave came. They struck under a sky swirling with purple lightning. The wind carried the scent of burnt metal and sweet rot. The outer sentries were torn apart, their blood used to paint runes across the palisade. When the war horns sounded, they were already inside the walls. The invaders were chaos warbands, but not Norscan. They wore no tribal marks. Their armor was etched with eyes that blinked and mouths that whispered. Their weapons writhed in their hands, blades flickering between shapes. Some of them were not men at all, beings of shifting flesh and flame, hovering inches above the snow, their eyes like black stars. The battle was a blur of terror and savagery. Warriors of the Wolfmaw fought with desperation, their axes cleaving into foes that bled smoke and madness. A demon of mirror-like skin waded through the defenses, each blow it struck turning men into salt statues. Another beast, a thing with no face and dozens of arms, slithered across the snow, flaying skin with caresses. Thorgard fought at the center of it all. His axe was red to the haft, and his body moved with unnatural speed, dodging blades that twisted through the air like snakes. He cut through a dozen foes, each death feeding the burning mark on his chest. It flared with power, and when he screamed his war cry, the very air shivered. But something deeper was stirring within him. At the height of the carnage, a demon lunged, twice as tall as a man, its limbs insectile, its eyes glittering like obsidian shards. It laughed without sound, its gaping maw opening to swallow Thorgard whole. He did not flinch. He roared, and the rune on his chest exploded with light. The demon halted mid-strike. It screamed, not in pain, but in recognition. Its flesh melted away like wax, and it collapsed into a puddle of ichor that hissed into the snow. The battle ended soon after. The warband, sensing something had changed, retreated into the storm, leaving behind a field of twisted bodies and mind-broken survivors. The Wolfmaw stood victorious, but not unshaken. In the days that followed, dread spread like rot. Some warriors began hearing voices from the fire. Others tore out their own eyes after staring too long at the sky. One man walked into the sea and never resurfaced. Those who had survived the night spoke Thorgard's name with reverence, or with fear, and always, watching from the shadows, was Adis. She walked the village now with a strange calm, her crow-feathered cloak never stirring in the wind, her blind eyes glowing faintly blue. She spoke little, but when she did, her words burrowed like worms into the hearts of men. Some began to follow her, to whisper prayers not to the old gods, but to something else. Tzeentch, the changer of ways. In a hidden chamber beneath the long hall, Erdis knelt before a circle of glimmering glyphs, her hands slick with the blood of a recently slaughtered goat. The bones she scattered twisted into unnatural shapes, snapping and fusing, forming the image of a man with wings of black fire. She smiled, her voice soft and full of hunger. "Soon, my prince, soon your shell shall crack." Behind her, in the stone wall, shadows shifted, and for a moment they watched her back. Outside, Thorgard stood alone at the edge of the sea, his hand pressed to the still glowing mark on his chest. He stared at the horizon where the storm clouds gathered, unaware that his every step, every kill, every thought was being shaped by unseen hands. The gods were watching, and the shadows in the north had only just begun to spread. Chapter 5. The Sundering of Kin. The sky above the Wolfmaw village burned with a bruised twilight, the sun a dim ember swallowed by rolling storm clouds. For weeks the air had grown heavier with dread, each day bringing new omens. Ravens tore at their own wings mid-flight, fish washed ashore eyeless and rotting, babies were born with mouths full of teeth. At night, the aurora borealis writhed like a serpent of flame, and in its coils men swore they saw faces grinning back at them. The tribe was splitting apart, its seams tearing like rotted sinew. On one side stood those who whispered prayers to Tzeentch, emboldened by the visions of the seeress. They painted their bodies with runes drawn from memoryless dreams, their eyes fever-bright with fanaticism. They called Thorgard chosen, bearer of the shadow crown, heir to the changer's promise. They claimed the storms were signs of his ascension, proof that the gods had blessed him. On the other side stood the old guard, warriors who still honored the ancient spirits of Norsca, who spat on chaos even as they feared it. They looked at Thorgard and saw not a savior, but a weapon forged by alien hands. They spoke Gerulf's name with loyalty, swore oaths to his leadership, and sharpened their axes in grim silence. By the third night of blood-mist skies, open conflict erupted. The first blow was struck in the mead hall, when two warriors, brothers by birth, argued over Thorgard's destiny. A word became a shove became a blade in the gut. By the time it ended, 3 were dead and the walls were slick with blood. The scent of murder spread like wildfire. Men stopped meeting each other's eyes. Old friends slept with their axes in hand. The tribe had become a warband of strangers. Gerulf tried to hold the reins, but his voice no longer carried the same weight. His decrees were questioned, his orders ignored. He saw the fever rising behind Thorgard's gaze and knew it for what it was, the god's hand in his bloodline. Yet he could not bring himself to kill his own son. Adis fanned the flames from the shadows, her voice a thread of poison in the ears of the discontented. By night she whispered to Thorgard, by day she counseled his growing followers. She reminded them of their hunger, their desperation, their rage. She told them the old ways had brought only frost and famine. Chaos would bring power, change, glory. And Thorgard began to believe her. The night of the sundering came beneath a sky of burning green and purple. Lightning cracked across the clouds without thunder. The village was silent but for the mutter of the storm. In the long hall, warriors stood arrayed on opposite sides, the hearth fire between them guttering low. On one side stood Gerulf, his old guard arrayed behind him, grim, scarred men and women whose eyes were sharp with conviction. On the other side, Thorgard's followers, painted in runes of ash and blood, eyes glinting fever-bright. Between them, Edis drifted like a wraith, her crow-feather cloak rustling without wind. "Father," Thorgard said, his voice a low growl, "stand aside. The old ways are dead. The gods have chosen a new path for us. You know this." Jorulf's single eye burned like an ember. "The gods you speak of are serpents, boy. They'll coil around you and squeeze until nothing of you remains. Stand down and I will spare you. Defy me and I'll cut you down like any traitor." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hiss of the fire. Then Edis whispered a single word, too quiet for the others to hear. But Thorgard's mark flared in response. His jaw tightened. He raised his axe. The long hall erupted in violence. Axes swung in great arcs, shields splintered, spears drove into flesh. The air filled with the roar of battle and the high-pitched screams of the dying. The floor became slick with blood and fat. Men who had hunted together for years now hacked each other apart like strangers, eyes rolling with rage and fear. A warrior loyal to Jorulf lunged at Thorgard with a spear. The younger man caught the shaft mid-thrust, snapped it like a twig, and drove the jagged end into the attacker's throat. Blood fountained hot across his chest. Another came at him with twin knives, but Thorgard moved faster than thought, his axe cleaving the man from shoulder to hip in one wet, terrible stroke. The rune on his chest pulsed brighter with every kill, feeding his strength, lending him speed and ferocity beyond mortal limits. His war cry was no longer entirely human. It echoed off the walls with a resonance like distant thunder, a sound that made the skin crawl. Through the chaos, Jorulf cut a path like an avalanche, his axe biting deep, his roar shaking the beams of the hall. He saw his son at the center of the slaughter, saw the glow on his chest, and for a moment his rage faltered. This was not the boy he had raised. This was something else. "Thorgard!" he bellowed, shouldering past a corpse. "Enough! Stop this madness!" Thorgard turned, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his fingers. His eyes were wild, but somewhere deep in them, the old Thorgard still flickered. For a heartbeat, father and son stood facing each other, amid the corpses of their kin. "Father," Thorgard's voice cracked. "I don't want—" Adis's voice cut through the din, a hiss like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Take what is yours." The rune flared blindingly bright. Thorgard's muscles moved before his will could stop them. He lunged forward, his axe arcing through the air. Jorulf raised his own weapon to parry, but the blow carried an inhuman force. Steel met steel with a shriek like tearing metal. Jorulf's axe snapped, and the blade of Thorgard's weapon buried itself deep in his father's chest. For a moment, everything went still. Jorulf staggered, a great gout of blood erupting from his mouth. His one eye met his son's, not with anger, but with sorrow. His hand rose, trembling, as though to touch Thorgard's face. "You were my blood," he rasped. Then collapsed to his knees. Thorgard caught him as he fell, dropping his axe, his hands slick with his father's lifeblood. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "No, I didn't." But Jorulf was already gone, his ember eye dimming as his body slumped lifeless to the blood-soaked floor. Around them, the battle faltered. Those loyal to Jorulf stared in horror. Those loyal to Thorgard raised their weapons and howled his name like a prayer. Thorgard knelt over his father's body, the rune on his chest glowing like a wound. Tears cut tracks through the blood on his face. Somewhere behind him, Adis smiled, a small, cold thing, hidden beneath her veil of feathers. The tribe was no more. The Wolfmaw had been sundered, its kinship broken, its future sealed in blood. Chapter 6. Into the Wastes. The wind in the chaos wastes did not howl. It screamed. It screamed with voices that had no mouths, with the death cries of civilizations long extinguished, with prayers twisted into curses. It tore across the blasted tundra like a blade, scouring flesh raw and peeling sanity from the skull like bark from a tree. Thorgard trudged into it alone. His boots crunched over ash that once might have been snow, or bone, or something older. The sky overhead churned in colors that should not exist, wounds in the firmament that bled light like pus. Shapes moved in those clouds, watching, smiling. Sometimes they whispered his name, not with breath, but with knowing. The road, Thorgard. He kept walking. His cloak was torn and caked with frozen gore. His face was gaunt, the beard thick with clots of dried blood. His eyes, once bright with purpose, were now sunken, shadowed things. The rune on his chest no longer glowed. It throbbed, a living brand that ached with every heartbeat. His axe was still at his side, crusted in his father's blood, and heavier now than it had ever been. Behind him, the world he had known lay in ruins. The long hall of the Wolfmaw smoldered, its charred bones poking through the snow like the ribs of a corpse. Those who had not followed him, those who had resisted, had either fled or died screaming. But even among the survivors, whispers had taken root. Patricide, demonkin, traitor of blood. Some hunted him now, vengeful remnants of the old ways, driven by hatred and grief. Others followed out of madness or devotion, whispering prayers to gods they didn't understand. But Thorgard had left them all behind, walking into the wastes alone, seeking silence, seeking penance. He found neither. The landscape twisted as he traveled north, mountains bent in impossible arcs. Rivers of molten glass wound through fields of eyeless flowers that screamed when stepped on. Trees bled black ichor when cut. The sky flickered between night and day in the blink of an eye. Time buckled. Sometimes he would wake and find himself days ahead or behind, or buried beneath a thin crust of snow he hadn't seen fall. And always the voices. However, they were echoes of memory, his father's last breath, the crunch of Joral's body hitting the floor. Then came others, the howls of dying warriors, the giggling of children he'd seen burnt during the sack of a Kislevite village. Then the voices changed, alien, layered things that spoke in riddles and paradox. Change is the only truth, Thorgard. Your flesh is the chrysalis. The eye is watching, always watching. He shouted into the wind, cursed the gods, begged them to leave him be. He hurled his axe into the snow and fell to his knees, screaming until his throat bled. They answered. One night, under a sky split by 3 moons, none of them the one he knew, Thorgard dreamt he stood before a mirror that showed not his reflection, but a version of himself crowned in horns, eyes ablaze with warp fire, wings of shadow stretching across the stars. He raised a hand to touch the glass, and the mirror shattered, shards embedding themselves in his skin. He woke with blood on his hands and something inside him, something awake. From then on the world became a blur. He walked with no memory of how far, how long. The rune on his chest had begun to speak, not in words, but in hunger. It itched, it burned. At night it opened, splitting his chest in a bloom of raw red flesh, and from it came whispers that made him weep and laugh in the same breath. He stopped eating. The flesh of beasts turned to writhing worms in his mouth. Water froze into screaming faces before he could drink. And yet he did not die. His body wasted, but his strength grew. He moved with the weightlessness of a corpse and the fury of a berserker. And then came the hunters. They found him on the edge of a frozen lake that shimmered like a sheet of obsidian. 5 warriors of the Wolfmaw, survivors of the Civil War, painted in war paint, faces masked by iron visors. They did not speak. They circled him like wolves. Thorgard stood, unarmed, his eyes hollow. Oing lunged. His blade struck Thorgard's side but found no purchase. Instead it sank into him as if into water. Thorgard turned his head slowly, and the hunter screamed as his arm began to rot from the elbow down. Flesh sloughed off, bone blackened. In moments, he was nothing but dust. The others attacked together. Steel flashed, blood flew, but Thorgard moved like a shadow, like a thought made flesh. He caught one blade mid-swing, snapped it, and drove the shards into the man's throat. Another fell beneath his knee. His skull caved in with one blow. One tried to run, but Thorgard raised his hand, and the snow rose like tendrils, wrapping around the man and dragging him down into the lake, which swallowed him without a ripple. The last stood frozen in terror. Thorgard looked at him, and the man dropped his sword. I followed you once, he croaked. Forgive me. Thorgard walked past him in silence. Behind him, the survivor fell to his knees, sobbing into his hands, until he realized his hands had no skin. Days, or perhaps moments, later, Thorgard reached a place no map held. A spire of glass and bone jutted from the center of a vast crater, surrounded by floating rocks that whispered names in forgotten tongues. The air buzzed with warp energy. Lightning crackled without clouds. The spire pulsed like a heart. He knew this place. He had seen it in dreams. Edith had once called it the wound of the world, the place where the veil between realms was thinnest. Here the gods listened. Thorgard dropped to his knees before the spire. His body broke open, skin splitting along his arms, bones cracking into new shapes, his breath hitching as his flesh melted and reformed in pulses. He screamed, not in pain, but in release. Around him, reality bent. Colors bled into each other, shapes formed and unformed. Hands reached from the earth, only to dissolve. And above, the clouds parted to reveal a single eye, vast, radiant, impossible, watching him. Waiting. Thorgard looked up, his mouth torn in a grin of agony and awe. "I am ready," he said, though his voice no longer sounded like his own. The wastes had claimed him. Now he would claim the world. Chapter 7. Demonic Crucible. The world ended in silence. No scream, no thunder, just a single breath drawn and never exhaled. One moment Thorgard stood before the pulsing spire, the rune on his chest burning like a brand of truth. The next, reality itself unraveled. Space folded in on itself, sucking him inward. The sky shattered like glass above him, each fragment catching reflections of 1,000 versions of himself, laughing, weeping, writhing. The wind stopped. The ground vanished. And then he fell. Not down, not up. He fell through. Through memory, through thought, through the marrow of existence. Time dilated. He saw his own birth, his own death, and the 1,000 lives he could have lived between. He heard his mother screaming in childbirth, and his own final breath in the same moment. And then the world snapped back into place. He stood on a hill of rusted bones beneath a sky of bleeding parchment. Mountains floated upside down in the distance, anchored by chains made from knotted intestines. Rivers of mercury flowed backward. Thunder cracked without clouds. Creatures beyond comprehension moved across the horizon, colossal silhouettes with too many limbs and no faces, dragging entire memories in their wake. Thorgard staggered forward. The ground pulsed beneath him like muscle. Every breath he took filled his lungs with fire. Every step brought echoes of voices. his father, his kin, the dead screaming in loops of regret. The rune on his chest burned with searing intensity, bleeding light through his flesh. He had entered the realm of chaos. His first trial came swiftly. A tower erupted from the ground before him, a monolith of glass and brass, each surface reflecting a different moment in time. Doors spun and changed. Laughter echoed from nowhere. A voice rang out, serene, intelligent, amused. "Come, son of Norsca, show me you are more than meat." Tzeentch, the architect of fate, claimed him first. Thorgard stepped into the tower, and the world shifted. He was no longer himself. He was Gerolf, standing on the eve of the rebellion. The hall was full of warriors. Thorgard, his son, stood before him, axe drawn. The fear, the love, the pride, it all came rushing back. He tried to shout, to warn, but he could not stop it. He watched as Thorgard's axe cleaved his chest open again, felt the warmth leave his body, fell to the ground, died again. Then he was Adis, whispering dark promises to herself in candlelight, praying not to understand but to control. Then a thrall being torn limb from limb by his own tribe. Then a raider, burning a village of weeping children. Each life fed the storm. Each sin, his or not, etched into his soul. Tzeentch's laughter filled his skull. There is no truth, only perception, only the spiral. Thorgard screamed and tore himself from the illusion, vomiting black bile that twisted into screaming birds and flew away. The sky cracked, the realm twisted. He was thrown into the next trial. He landed in a pit of steaming blood, the air choked with musk and perfume, skulls piled in delicate towers. The air throbbed with laughter, gasps, moans. From a dais of skin Slaanesh waited, eyes like twin galaxies, mouth curled in pleasure and cruelty. "Poor tormented soul," the god purred, stretching out an arm. "Come, let me make you whole." Visions engulfed him, Thorgard triumphant, adored by millions, worshipped like a god. Beautiful warriors knelt at his feet, his father, alive again, weeping with pride, Aedis bowing, his tribe cheering, the world burning in his name, every desire fulfilled. He dropped to his knees, the pleasure of imagined victory washing over him like molten gold. But something inside rebelled. His rage, his shame, his guilt. He rose, howling, and tore the illusion from his mind like flesh from bone. The dream shattered. Slaanesh hissed, not in pain, but delight. "Good, you will burn so beautifully." He was cast out again. The world changed. He now stood upon a mountain of skulls under a red sky raining boiling blood. War horns roared, beasts snarled in the distance, chains dragged across the earth. Here, Khorne waited. Yornikova waited. No illusions, no words, only the trial of the blade. A warrior emerged, massive, armored, a daemon bound in brass, a hammer of the blood god. Twin axes roared with flame in its hands. It charged. Thorgard met it with nothing but his axe and raw fury. They clashed like titans. Each strike sent shockwaves through the skull mountain. Steel met bone. Blood sprayed in arcs. Thorgard took wounds, deep gouges across his chest, a broken rib, a nearly severed arm, but he did not yield. They fought for hours or days, locked in primal combat. When the demon stumbled, Thorgard roared and leapt, driving his axe through the beast's head. Black blood erupted, the demon convulsed, then fell. From above, a chorus of howls. Khorne did not speak, but the air trembled with approval. A crown of iron formed above Thorgard's head, glowing for a moment, then crumbling into ash. One trial remained. The world plunged into utter decay. Thorgard sank into a swamp of rotting corpses, the air thick with disease and sorrow. The sky sagged with green clouds. In the distance, Nurgle stirred, bloated and laughing, his skin splitting open to birth flies the size of dogs. "You have suffered, little one," Nurgle cooed. "Come into my arms. End the pain. Join the garden." Thorgard staggered through the muck, maggots eating into his wounds. His flesh festered, bubbled, sloughed. Every step was agony. Visions danced before him, his tribe diseased and wailing. His own face melted, his soul rotting. He dropped, crawling, vomiting bile and worms. But he refused to stop. He clawed through the rot, dragged himself across the filth. He bled pus and madness, and when he reached the center of the swamp, a single dying tree pulsing with life, he gripped it and roared, defying the death that gripped his soul. Nurgle's laughter rumbled like 1,000 thunderclaps. "Even in decay you fight. Delicious." The trials ended. Thorgard collapsed, and the gods watched. His body levitated, suspended above the filth, the fire, the ash, the mirrors. Each of the 4 chaos gods marked him in turn, not fully, not yet, but each laid claim to a piece of his soul. His eyes rolled back, his skin cracked, light spilling out in radiant agony. His screams tore through the realms. In the sky above the realm of chaos, a star ignited. A new prince was forming, not yet born, but no longer man. Guard's journey through the demonic crucible was complete. The next step would be ascension, or annihilation. Chapter 8. The Ascension Rite. The sky split open. Above the jagged cliffs of Norsca, a storm churned unlike any seen before, a living vortex of colorless flame and bleeding stars, vomiting bolts of lightning that screamed as they struck the earth. The air was thick with ash and warp taint, heavy enough to crush the breath from lungs. Wolves fled into the sea. Trees bent backwards and snapped. The ocean itself retched, casting up bloated corpses of sea beasts with eyes in impossible places. At the center of it all, atop the altar of broken fates, stood Adis. She was no longer the veiled witch of whispers. Her robes had fallen away, revealing a body etched with pulsating runes and veins of blue fire. Her eyes, once empty sockets, now radiated raw warp light, gazing into realms beyond comprehension. Her voice was not her own. It echoed with a chorus of 1,000 murmurs, each one layered atop the next like coils of a serpent. The altar was a nightmare of bone and obsidian, arranged in spiraling geometry that defied mortal logic. Skulls of chieftains and unborn children alike had been fused into its form, their mouths forever agape in silent wails. Around it, a ring of cultists swayed and gibbered, their faces painted in blood and filth, their minds long since surrendered. Above them, the storm churned faster, the sky collapsing inward. A vortex yawned open, not a hole in the sky, but a tear in reality itself, from which poured light so pure and corrupted it flayed the eyes of all who dared look upon it. Adis raised her arms, fingers splayed. "The rite is complete," she shrieked, her voice a gale of madness. "Witness the unmaking of flesh. Witness the birth of Tzeentch's heir." From the spiraling void above, a shriek erupted. Neither human, nor beast, nor god, but all of them at once. The ground quaked, mountains cracked, rivers reversed their flow, villages 100 leagues away collapsed into their own shadows. The auroras twisted into screaming faces, and then the rift bled open. From within the warp, something vast stirred. First came the wings, not feathers, not leather, but great constructs of living shadow, each feather and eye blinking with knowledge forbidden and old. They unfurled slowly, eclipsing the storm-racked sky, casting darkness over the land even as lightning flared around them. Next, the flaming blade, long as a cart, forged from the purest fire, stolen from the very heart of Tsench's realm. It burned, not with heat, but with change, reshaping reality itself with every flicker. Trees twisted to stone, stones turned to blood, blood crystallized into weeping obsidian. And then he stepped forth. Thorgard, but no longer the man he had been. His body had grown impossibly tall, his skin a swirling mass of sigils and shifting hues. Horns coiled from his temples like the spirals of fate itself. His eyes were voids, bottomless, radiant pits where stars lived and died in an instant. Each step he took melted the snow, then turned it to iron, then to flame, then to ash. Reality rejected him, but could not banish him. He descended from the tier with regal slowness, wings spread wide, blade at his side, and a crown of ever-shifting bone hovering inches above his skull. The cultists dropped to their knees, eyes weeping blood, tongues wagging with ecstatic praise. "Prince, Prince, Prince of Change, Crown of the Impossible, Lord of Becoming." Midas fell to the ground, laughing, sobbing, writhing. "It is done. He lives. He becomes." But not all knelt. From the shadows of the ravaged hills came the last of the loyal, those few warriors of the Wolfmaw who had survived the sundering and resisted the madness. Their armor was cracked, their furs were soaked in blood, but their eyes burned with grim resolve. Among them stood Skorvald, Jorolf's brother, his face a ruin of grief and fury. He pointed his war-axe at the demon prince. "A thing is no son of Norsca," he spat. "It is an abomination. For Jorolf, for our people, kill it." The warriors charged, but time bent at Thorgard's will. He raised his hand, and the very ground beneath them exploded into shrieking vortexes. Warriors were flung into the sky, only to return as ash. Some simply vanished. Others were transformed, one moment charging with a blade, the next screaming as their body melted into a river of insects. Skorvald alone reached the base of the altar, swinging his axe in a mighty arc. Thorgard caught it, not with his weapon, but with thought. The blade froze mid-air, then shattered into shards of memory. Skorvald's life flashed before his own eyes, his first kill, his first kiss, his final breath, all stolen by the thing that was once his nephew. "Thorgard," he whispered. "I was Thorgard," the demon replied, voice like cracking crystal. "Now I am possibility." He touched Skorvald's forehead. The old warrior dissolved into sparks. Silence fell. The cultists wept with joy. Adès collapsed, her body withered by the ritual, yet her smile still stretched wide. Her work was complete. Thorgard turned his gaze to the horizon. All of Norsca lay before him, ruined, broken. He spread his wings, and the storm screamed, rising to a crescendo that would never fade. Chapter 9. Wrath of the Gods. The last sunrise over the Wolfmaw lands was not a sunrise at all. The heavens had changed. The sky no longer bore a sun, but a churning eye of colorless flame, Tsench's eye, burning without heat, spinning endlessly. Where its gaze fell, the land twisted, mutated, wept. Trees grew tongues, rivers sang lullabies to the corpses caught in their flow. Men found their shadows crawling away from them at dusk, whispering secrets. The air buzzed with unnatural energy. Birds burst into clouds of teeth mid-flight. Children were born with knowledge they should not possess. And atop the blackened altar of broken fates, the abomination that had once been Thorgard spread his wings wide and watched the world reshape. But not all had submitted. Beyond the circle of madness, among the scorched ruins of the Wolfmaw's shattered halls, the last of the tribe's true blood gathered. Scattered clans, survivors, shield maidens, and old warriors who had weathered famine, fire, and betrayal. They bore broken shields, blood-worn blades, and grief carved into their bones. Their faces were smeared in war paint. Their bodies were scarred, armored with iron and conviction. They came not as soldiers, but as executioners. Among them strode Brynja Icetongue, priestess of the old gods, her mouth stitched shut with runes, her hands wrapped in wolf sinew, soaked in the blood of her own sons. At her side marched Ulgar Hrossen, Thorgard's childhood friend, now a behemoth in iron, dragging behind him a hammer forged from the wreckage of their Longhall's hearthstone. Behind them, warriors of every age, teens with fire in their eyes, old berserkers shaking with rage, came to make war not just on a god, but on the lie of divinity itself. They were the last howl of the dying world. They came through the storm, screaming. To overcame, Thorgard saw them approach. He rose from the altar's throne of bleeding bone, his wings unfurling like the pages of a forbidden tome. His body was taller than any mortal man, and his skin flowed with changing hues, one moment dark as void, the next glowing like molten glass. His eyes burned with blue fire, his flaming blades sang with the voices of the damned. He did not speak. He simply descended. The battle began with a cry from Brynja as she tore the stitches from her lips and bellowed the true name of ice, summoning a storm that battered even the chaos-warped sky. Shards of freezing wind howled like spirits, crashing into the demonic horde that rose behind Thorgard, flamers, screamers, spawn, and twisted remnants of fallen tribes. The land itself shuddered under the weight of what followed. The wrath of the gods. Ulgar was the first to strike. He charged, dragging his maul behind him, roaring Thorgard's name like a curse. The demon prince responded with a wave of his hand, sending a tide of warp flame screaming toward the charging warrior. Ulgar disappeared in the fire. But then, with a roar, he emerged, flesh half-melted, armor fused to muscle, but still alive, still fighting. He leapt, bringing his hammer down in a strike that cracked the earth. The blow smashed into Thorgard's chest, sending a shock-wave through the altar. The demon staggered. For a moment, just a moment, the impossible seemed wounded. Then Thorgard laughed, a sound like shattered glass and breaking minds. He drove his flaming blade through Olgar's gut, lifting the man into the air. Olgar coughed blood, then laughter. With both hands, he pulled Thorgard's blade deeper into his own belly, anchoring the demon in place. "Do it, Brynja," he howled. The priestess unleashed her final rite. A spear of ice, carved from the tears of widows and the bones of stillborns, hurled through the air. It struck Thorgard square in the back, piercing his wing, pinning him to the altar. He screamed. Reality fractured. The sky erupted in 1,000 fractured storms. Warp rifts opened and closed like breathing wounds. Daemons shrieked and evaporated. Time itself buckled, replaying moments of the battle out of order. Warriors saw themselves die, then fight again, then scream in languages they never knew. Brynja dropped to her knees, blood pouring from her nose, her mouth foaming with arcane rot. And still they fought. Warriors clashed with demons in hand-to-claw carnage. Blood soaked the stones, arms were torn from sockets, jaws shattered. One man, frothing with madness, gouged out his own eyes to resist a demon's hypnotic gaze, then fought on by sound alone until he was crushed beneath a flamer's bulk. A shield maiden was dragged screaming into the sky by a screamer of Tzeentch, but she split its belly with her axe mid-air, raining boiling ichor down upon her comrades before they were engulfed in flame. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. Thorgard rose from the altar, the spear of ice melting from his back. He howled, and the sound sundered the mountain itself. A third eye opened upon his brow, weeping fire. His blade grew longer, heavier, and with each swing the world warped. But for all his might, he bled. His wings hung in tatters, his chest heaved. The power of ascension had made him more, but it had not made him invincible. Not yet. And the mortals knew it. The final charge came like the last heartbeat of a dying god. Warriors flung themselves at Thorgard, no longer seeking victory, only vengeance. They died in droves, ripped apart, consumed, changed into living nightmares, but they carved wounds into him. They made him feel. He staggered. He howled. And then, from the rear of the battlefield, came a horn. Lo! Ancient, Wolfmaw, the last of the true-blooded clans, had arrived, graybeards bearing banners soaked in the blood of their ancestors, their chants cutting through the madness like a blade. The final blow did not come from a blade. It came from memory. Thorgard, bloodied and surrounded, heard a voice. Uriel's voice. "My son." The daemon frowns. Asked for a breath. And in that breath, Brynja crawled through the muck, pressed her hand to the altar, and uttered the final banishment, an ancient curse, known only to the priesthood, one meant to bind daemonkind in the names of the old gods. Thorgard turned too late. The altar shattered. Light engulfed him, not holy, not pure, but old, raw, primordial. His body convulsed, wings seizing, blade shattering in his grasp. He screamed, not in pain, but in defiance. The light tore through him, ripping at his essence, peeling away power like bark from a tree. But Tzeentch does not abandon his tools. As the light swallowed him, a rent in space tore open. A clawed hand, huge, gleaming with impossible colors, reached through and dragged Thorgard into the warp before the rite could be completed. He vanished with a shriek that echoed across the realms. And then, silence. The storm died. The demons crumbled into dust. The survivors, those few who had not been broken or burned or driven mad, stood in the ashes, weeping, laughing, silent. Their world was gone, their chieftain a god thing, their tribe extinct. Only the gods remained. And somewhere in the eye of the warp, Thorgard watched, waiting, changing, becoming. Chapter 10. The World Burns. The first omen came not from the sky, but from the earth. Across the war-ravaged north, the ground split open with veins of fire carving through tundra and stone as if the world itself had begun to bleed. Villages cracked in half. Glaciers screamed as they melted into rivers of glowing ichor. Ancient cairns burst apart, their stones rearranging themselves into symbols that had no meaning. Until it was too late. Then came the skies. Above the shattered peaks of Norsca the heavens wept blood and madness. The sun no longer rose. Instead, a second sky loomed above the first, twisting, writhing. A kaleidoscope of faces, beasts, and ruin. Comets of brass and bone fell from its depths, crashing into the earth and releasing tides of demonkind. Where they landed, reality bent, forests turned to glass, lakes boiled into clouds, wolves gave birth to birds that sang in reverse. And at the center of it all, Thorgard. In turn, ascended, unchained. He descended upon the ruins of his homeland not as man, not even as daemon prince, but as a calamity given flesh. He had grown beyond form, towering above the landscape, his wings spread wide like curtains of night, their eyes blinking in perfect rhythm. His face was a shifting mask, One moment Thorgard, the next 1,000 other beings, all screaming, laughing, whispering in tongues older than stars. He no longer carried a blade. His very presence was a weapon. Villages collapsed into dust as he passed. Mountains crumbled into sand. Men and women burst into ash with a word, or worse, were left alive, but changed. Entire clans twisted into grotesque parodies of their former selves, their bones made liquid, their prayers fused into endless chants to the architect of fate. He stood upon the cliffs of Norsca, where once his tribe had hunted mammoth and sung tales of valor. There, beneath a bleeding moon, he raised a single clawed hand, and the sky opened. A rift tore across the heavens, yawning wide from horizon to horizon, vomiting forth the armies of Tzeentch. Thousands upon thousands of daemons poured into the world, flamers, screamers, pink horrors, lords of change, an endless tide of mutation and fire. Behind them marched his army, the eclipsed host, mortals who had surrendered to him, reshaped into towering horrors armored in soul steel and crowned with glowing brands. They swept south like a plague. Kislev was the first to fall. The city of Erengrad, once a proud bastion against the northern menace, erupted in blue flame. Its towers danced, its rivers turned to snakes. The defenders screamed as their weapons melted and their minds unraveled. Ice witches were consumed from within, their hearts replaced with clocks that ticked backwards. The bear god did not answer. Within a fortnight, the entire coast was in ruin. Next came the Empire. The armies of the Elector Counts mustered along the Ostermark border, grim banners raised beneath storm-torn skies. Cannons, halberdiers, steam tanks, all prepared to make their final stand. Priests of Sigmar marched at the head, their eyes wild with fury, their hammers kissed with silver flame. And then the sky broke again. Thorgard arrived not with thunder, but with silence, an absence of sound so total that it deafened every man on the field. No horns, no drums, just the soft flutter of wings overhead, thousands of demon bats circling like vultures. Then came the fire. Not red, not orange, but blue, burning colder than death. A wave of arcane energy swept the battlefield, peeling armor like paper, turning warhorses inside out mid-gallop. Men screamed as their thoughts were stolen, words dying in their mouths before they could speak. Thorgard walked through it all. Every step rewrote reality. A steam tank crumbled into dust and reformed into a living, weeping statue. A company of greatswords vanished and reappeared sewn into each other, a writhing wall of flesh that begged to die. Bright wizards tried to answer fire with fire, but their spells turned on them, their own familiars laughing as they were incinerated. Sigmar's chosen fell, one by one. Their prayers were swallowed by the storm, and when the last soldier collapsed, spitting blood, whispering the name of his long-dead mother, Thorgard raised his arms and willed the city of Talheim to fall. It did. The earth opened, a great maw that swallowed stone and steel and sin alike. Talheim, the eye of the forest, was reduced to a crater of teeth and fire. None were spared. From Middenheim to Altdorf, terror spread like wildfire. Cults rose, the weak fled, the strong bent the knee. Tzeentch laughed. And still Thorgard advanced. He no longer spoke. He no longer needed to. His will was a tide, his thoughts law. He became the war. He was the god's wrath made manifest. Cities became fonts of corruption. Forests sprouted limbs and eyes. Rivers flowed uphill, singing songs of despair. The world warped. Even the chaos gods took notice. Corn roared for vengeance. his blood letters clashing with the eclipsed host. Slaanesh cooed in envy, seeking to corrupt the prince now beyond seduction. Nurgle watched with bloated pride, delighted by the sheer decay of order. But Thorgard belonged to none. Not anymore. He had become something new. A harbinger of change not even the gods could predict. A weapon forged in sorrow, betrayal, and madness. The heir of a tribe long dead. A chieftain who had slain his own blood, walked through hell, and emerged crowned in fire. The North was his. The Empire trembled. The world burned. And far, far above, in the ever-turning spiral of the warp, Tzeentch watched and smiled.